Shit, I hate it when that happens. I do a whole load of dialogue and then I look down at my webcam and find it wasn't even recording. That's what's just happened now. So let's have a go. Take two and all that. I'd like to start off with an apology, well, two apologies. One, an apology for rambling on already to everybody, but the other apology is to Noah, Veritas48. This is a reply to him. I did say to him that I wouldn't make this reply till the end of the week. That suited my schedule. It also suited him, I believe, because he's got lots of video responses to make. He's also starting a new job. Congratulations on it, Noah. I hope that pans out very well. But atheists such as myself are inherently lying bastards, so here I am making the video response nice and early. Now, I'd asked two questions, both to cast doubt on the notion of God that you were proposing. Not to deliver a knockdown blow, not to disprove. I don't think that's possible. I don't like to think in those terms. There's very few situations in life when you can actually even cast severe doubt on something with one single argument. It usually takes a whole basket of different types of evidence and arguments to do that, I would suggest. But I made two different points. The first one of them was to do with the existence or non-existence of an immaterial immortal soul. So let's see what Noah has to say to what I had to say on that matter.
Christianity could still be false, and God could still exist. A single monotheistic God could still exist, which is why we tried to offer a conception of God devoid of religious particulars that surround revelation. Okay? We wanted to keep this about God because this is the concept you need to destroy as an atheist.
Okay, so I'll play you a little bit more Veritas in a minute, but basically his argument is that the argument that I've proposed is irrelevant to the God that they have classified, that it only applies to the specifics of Abrahamic faith in this instance. Well, you know, when I recorded my original video, I'm far from perfect, and I very rarely manage to record a video perfectly the first time. Usually takes me a few goes. I usually end up, you see, I talk very fast when I do my videos. I'm a bit like a CD burner that's working at maximum speed. I end up getting buffer underruns and end up talking ahead of what I can actually think to come out with. So that tends to happen sometimes. But in one of those preliminary takes that never made the final cut, I did make the point myself that I didn't know whether, strictly speaking, the argument I was making fitted in to the categories, to the God that you were proposing. But just let me play another clip, and then I'll explain to you why I think, in a way, it really does fit in, and why it is an argument that you have to entertain. Here's Noah again.
That said, again, if you're right, and if you can somehow show that the soul does not exist, then all you've done is cast doubt onto one aspect of my religion, which, if that's where the evidence leads, then rightly so, it should cast doubt on it. However, what it would not do is say anything as to the existence of a God characterized by the properties we've previously described.
Okay, well, I reject that claim on practical grounds. I don't want to get too embroiled in the subject of omnibenevolence. I know Fat German Bastard is partly involved in that discussion with you. I actually exchanged a couple of PMs with him on this subject because there's a few points that I'm interested in with your with the way you're handling omnibenevolence, but I don't really want to get involved in it myself. It's a discussion I've had too many times, and I want to focus on these particular things. But it's a very interesting thing, omnibenevolence, on the face of it. Just the idea of benevolence, of the idea of God's acts and how we reflect on God's acts. You see, how do we often reflect on God's acts? What happens when a child's born that's terribly, horribly deformed and really suffering, but perhaps the child's born with no skin? And it's really a few tragic hours of pain and torment followed by a death that just doesn't come fast enough. How do you square that particular circle? Well, this is a conversation I've had many times. I'm not going to describe to you what the usual defence is. I'll leave that to Philos 71 to provide the usual defence.
And inside a tiny little atheistic box say, aha, see, there's no God. If there were a God, he'd be evil in allowing this to happen. But atheist, if that's what you're thinking, you don't know what God was really doing. The family, straight to heaven. The girl is being...
Yeah, you see, almost every single time you get a defence for God's omnibenevolence, it boils down to some kind of unseen reparation that can take place after we're dead. That involves us having a spiritual component. That involves us having a soul, does it not? So if you want to defend this characteristic which you have asserted of omnibenevolence, I think it's very difficult for you to do it if we don't have this spiritual component. Now, I've got to say, in your defence, I haven't heard you use that as a defence of omnibenevolence, but then I haven't heard you make a defence of omnibenevolence. You've laid it out on the table as one of the characteristics, and then as soon as somebody mentions it, you just withdraw it from the discussion and say, well, that's not really something that's open for discussion. Doesn't matter how seemingly grotesque an act is, we can say nothing about it or nothing on the back of it. As long as you remain in that position, then fair enough, I suppose. We can leave the soul thing to one side. Though I really don't see why you even posit omnibenevolence as a criteria, as a quality of God, if it's such a meaningless one. Anyway, that's that one. Let's move on to this second subject now. Okay, so the second subject dealt with a couple of issues pertaining or relating to God's omniscience. I'm not going to go through the whole thing now. Watch my last video if you want to hear the arguments, but I presented two arguments. The first argument was simply to show that perhaps you could have a God that wasn't omniscient, and then the second was to see what we could learn from that. So let's just see the first thing that Noah has to say about that.
Of course it's possible that there is a person who created the universe who's not omniscient. Of course that's possible. But that's not the sort of God we believe in. I mean, despite our disparity on how we believe God has revealed himself to mankind, we do agree on the fact that he's omniscient. And a whole bunch of other things too. I mean, this is the concept of God that we're offering to you. One that is omniscient. So responding by saying, well, there could be a God who is not omniscient is like the most irrelevant rejoinder I can think of.
I'm frankly flabbergasted that you should say that this is an irrelevance. You know, let's not portray this as a false dichotomy. It's either your God or no God. That isn't the case, is it? You know that as much as I do. So it's just as relevant for me to argue from the perspective of a different God as it is for me to argue from the perspective of no God. They both have the same effect on the God that you're trying to argue for. They both cast doubt on the God that you're trying to argue for, do they not? So it's not an irrelevance at all. The reason I actually brought this argument up is because I wanted to make the second argument. And I thought, now if I make this second argument, Noah might come back to me and say, this argument is irrelevant because it could be, because there's no possibility that God could be anything other than omniscient because of, and then wheel out your argument. So I wanted to open up, make sure that we're both singing from the same hymn sheet, that we both accept the possibility that God may not be omniscient. That was the point of that argument. It was, as it turned out, it wasn't necessary because you've happily accepted that it could be that God may not be omniscient. So we can leave that behind and move on to the really important argument, which was the next one.
And the question assumes that omniscience is the sort of thing that one can have and be mistaken about it.
No, it doesn't assume that at all. What it assumes is that omniscience is the kind of thing you may not have, but be mistaken about it. Mistaken in the belief that you do have it. That you can have a God that isn't omniscient, that believes himself incorrectly to be omniscient, that incorrectly reports himself to us as being omniscient. And how would you ever know? How would you be able to differentiate between the genuinely omniscient God and the God who just reports himself erroneously as being omniscient? You're just assuming that your God is the genuinely omniscient God. Can you actually have a genuinely omniscient God, including having the actual knowledge of his own status with regard to his omniscience? I don't know. I'm agnostic about that. I would hope that you were too. I would hope that everybody is, because I don't see how you can not be, how you can arrive at a conclusion at that one. But that's not what I'm talking about. That isn't what throws the spanner in the works. What throws the spanner in the works is the God that is not omniscient, who erroneously believes himself to be omniscient. You don't deal with that. You deal with deceitful gods, which was something else I brought up. Forget about the deceitful God. Forget about the genuinely omniscient God, if that's at all possible. Let's deal with this key category here, which is the non-omniscient God who genuinely believes himself to be omniscient, but isn't. Can you rule that out? Can you provide me with either an empirical or a philosophical argument that rules that out? I don't think you can. In fact, when it comes to ruling things in and out, I'd just like to play another little clip of something that you have to say now.
Until I have some clear, positive reasons to think that that's the case, the mere possibility of this is not enough for me to change my position.
Okay, I've got to be quick due to time, but you know, this doesn't seem to sit very well, Noah, because what you're saying here is, on the balance of evidence, I think the deceitful God's less likely than the undeceitful God, so I'm going to make a rational decision based on that. But on so many other arguments in this same debate, not necessarily to me, but to other people, you seem to have eschewed the idea of balance of evidence. As long as you can make some kind of argument, it doesn't matter how contrived, doesn't matter how windy and tortuous the path up the cliff is, it doesn't matter. As long as you can come up with something that provides a tiny skerrick for you to still cling to, that's enough for you to maintain your position rather than adopting the other position on the basis of balance of evidence. It doesn't seem like you're being very equitable there. You're picking and choosing which kind of philosophy you're going to follow in terms of how you weight the evidence. Well, thanks for watching this video. I don't know how many I can't have many seconds left. Bye for now.